Hello, everyone. Welcome. I will give a few seconds to let folks join us today. Well, first, I just want to welcome everyone today to our ILNet webinar on how to create best board and staff relationships in your CIL. My name is Mary Kate Wells, and I use the pronouns she, her. I am the program director at the National Council on Independent Living. For a brief visual description, I am a white female, short reddish hair, wearing a maroon shirt, and I will be helping moderate today. Um, just a few accessibility notes before we get started. Captions are available today on this webinar. You can click Show Subtitle in your Zoom menu to turn them on. And we also have captions running on an external link where you can edit and adjust the font size and color of the text. And that link is in the chat. We also have ASL interpreters present today. They should always be visible as we're viewing in gallery view. Please let us know if you cannot see the interpreters. Another note on ASL, we also have an ASL channel running where you should be able to see the interpreters as well. So you should have two options. As you all know, Zoom has been doing some updates and has changed some of the settings in Zoom, where on a mobile device, you might not be able to see the ASL interpreters unless they're in the channel. So please communicate with us in the chat or the question and answer box if at any point you are having trouble seeing the interpreters. Public chat is turned off, but you are able to speak with the panelist and host in the chat box. We ask that we reserve the chat box for technical questions. And then you can submit any questions for panelists and speakers in the Q&A box, which is located at the bottom of your screen. If you would like, or if it's easier to email me your questions, you can email me at mary-kate@ncil.org. Next slide, please. Today's presentation is brought to you by the Administration for Community Living at the United States Department of Health and Human Services in conjunction with the ILNet. Next slide. The ILNet Training and Technical Assistance Center is operated by ILRU in collaboration with NICL, April, and the University of Montana. And the logos of all of the organizations are on the slide screen. Next slide. And these webinars are part of the INR Training and Technical Assistance Center, which provides training and technical assistance to centers for independent living, statewide independent living councils, designated state entities, and board members, which we're very excited to have many board members from centers here today. NICL is a partner of the ILNet Center and help coordinate with these webinars. Next slide. Oh, no, actually, we're learning directions. So we're on the right side. So just to review, just set the framing for today. Today, you will learn to clarify what the executive director does, what the board chair does, and the role of a full board. How to apply independent living philosophy in the composition and work of a CIL board, and provide CIL board members with information that they might need to meet the responsibilities for overseeing the work of a center, but not overstepping. Next slide. And we would just give a quick reminder that we'll be sharing an evaluation link at the end of the webinar. And we would greatly appreciate any feedback you have. And we take it very seriously. So with that, I'm going to invite Paula to join us on the screen and kick us off. Paula will be facilitating this conversation.
Hello, everyone. I'm Paula McElwee. I'm an older, silver-haired, Scottish-complected woman in a pink shirt, black jacket. Dog in the background may bark. Sorry. My disability is a chronic pain condition, and then in addition to that, a neurological mystery, which may cause me to not be able to speak for a few seconds. Just hang in there. I'll be right back if that happens. And with us today, I am so excited because some of you are board members coming to this training, and we have two board members who are also presenting with us. So I'm going to let Renee introduce herself at this time.
Hello, my name is Renee. I'm from CIL, Ohio. I am a woman who is 65 years old, so I am an old lady. I've been the chair of my local county, my local cell diabetes center of Greater CIL in 2003. So I just got done being chair of my board, and I am also a former self member. I just completed that in March of this year.
Okay, thank you, Renee. And then Beth, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, hi everyone. I'm Beth Ruffin. My pronouns are she and her. I am a middle-aged Black woman with short curly hair, and I am a board member at ABLE SC, and my disabilities are fibromyalgia, hard of hearing. I have ADHD as well as depression and anxiety, and I'm excited to be here with all of you today.
Great, thank you both. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk about this issue of how boards and staff interact within a center, but we want to also give you some additional resources. So this is also found in the presentation. You have a copy of that or a link to that in your registration information, but that includes taking a look at all of the orientation options that we have at ILNet. We have a lot of options for you, but the most exciting one for us is we have a brand new manual for boards. So for CIL boards and the staff that interact with them, we now have this in a manual format, and it was released on Monday, so hot off the press. Next slide, please. We're going to look at some of the challenges that independent living boards experience. We know that not all board members have the understanding of independent living philosophy. So understanding and promoting that is a key role. Certainly hiring and supervising an executive director is a key role for all boards of centers. There are other legal responsibilities, and we'll discuss some of those. And then we're also going to talk about the financial responsibilities, because I think all of us know of or may be familiar with situations where if you don't follow and take care of those financial responsibilities, you have yourself a potential problem. So we'll be talking about all of those things. Next slide, please. We're going to talk about how you can actually put some things into practice that have to do with IL philosophy. So here are a couple of key points. The first one is consumer control, and we hope that as a board you understand consumer control, because you are a consumer-controlled board. 51% or more of the members of your board of directors at a center must be people with significant disabilities. So in the day-to-day governance of your center, you should see disability control. But also in the day-to-day operations, 51% of your staff should be people with disabilities, preferably significant disabilities, as part of the affirmative action approach of centers. So in your programming and your service delivery, in everything you do, you want to be consumer controlled. That is a key component of what we call the IL philosophy, the independent living philosophy. Another key component of the independent living philosophy is advocacy. Advocacy is a core service, but it is also a core belief that in order for us to change what's happening in the community, we need to be advocates. We need to be advocating for what is happening for and with people with disabilities. But the individual also is involved in advocacy. The person who is receiving services may also be learning to advocate for themselves and working with your center so that advocacy makes things change in your community as a whole or at large. Let's look at the next slide. Another component is to involve folks of all disabilities. So we're cross disability. So we don't only serve people who are blind or deaf or spinal cord injured, but we serve every disability. And we want to be involved with them in helping them to obtain all of their civil rights, including the right to reside in their own home and community. We also do some work on this through peer support. So what we call peer support, sometimes in the law, it's actually called peer counseling, but often your center doesn't call it that because the term counseling has restrictions within your state about who can call themselves a counselor. So often you'll see this term peer support. And we want to see people actualize peer support as it was originally intended. And that means peers are people with disabilities who are involved with the people who come to you for services. So that might be in mentoring, in counseling, in assisting and supporting, and look at all these things, educating, guiding, empowering. It goes on, but the point is that peers with disabilities are assisting the people who come to you with disabilities, and it makes your place, your center, completely disability run and disability controlled. This plays a key role in the driving force of what it is that centers are, right? Let's take a look at that next slide. So you want to ensure that the mission of your center, which is developed by the board, the mission of your center upholds the rights of individuals with disabilities to be not just present in their community, although that's part of it. We want people to live in the community as opposed to other places, but also to be fully and meaningfully engaged members of their communities. So IL, independent living, is not about charity. It's not about saviorism or saving people. It's not about helping needy, vulnerable, folks with special needs, voiceless, differently abled. You pick one of those terms that's used out there in the community sometimes as part of their ableist approach to us. That's not who independent living is. So independent living is about peers, empowering peers to lead and control their own lives. Let's look at that next slide. Now, in order to do this, I want to look at what the other centers do or what these other board members do. So let's take a look at that. And if you would share your thoughts with us now, Renee, that would be great.
And part of that, the main point of independent living philosophy is consumer control. And many board members who come on the board, they are well-meaning, they have all kinds of experience being on other kinds of boards, and we need their expertise in different areas. However, independent living center is unique in that we promote the IL philosophy, which means that we give people the ability to control their own life. When I was chair of the board, I worked with my executive director. I said, let's give an intense presentation to the board on IL philosophy. It was an hour presentation. And I suggested that we do that every few years so we catch all the new board members who are coming in. I took it a step further. Remember, when you're on the board, you're not in charge of staff. So I suggested to my executive director that he allowed me to do the presentation to his upper staff. Like he had like six direct supervisors. So I did the presentation for them because I felt it was important to get the staff on board. Like Paula said, also, we have to get the new members to understand that. So I'm not charity. We give people the tools to navigate their own life. We give them the skills, the tools, and then we send them off to navigate their own life. They can always come back to us if they get stuck or something, but we give them the power to do it on their own. And it's super important that board members understand this. Okay, go ahead. Another thing I suggested is that when new board members come on, we hook them up with somebody who's already on the board with lived experience. That is a super way to get new board members understanding if they don't have a disability. That way they can see firsthand how people navigate their own lives. Go ahead.
Okay, Beth, we'd like to hear a couple of thoughts from you.
Yes, this is Beth speaking. And at ABLE SC, first and foremost, board members during orientation and onboarding we are told about and taught the IL philosophy, as well as ongoing training opportunities. But in addition to that kind of classroom learning, we are also given opportunities to interact with our community through events, learning about the organization's impact, through quarterly updates that we receive from staff around the programs, the progress of the strategic plan, the success and the success stories as well of the programs, the staff, and the consumers. I'm always amazed every board meeting with all of the wonderful things that the organization is doing. And of course, as board members, we really rely on the staff to provide us with a lot of those updates. It's also imperative that we invest in the organization through financial contributions, but also through volunteer opportunities, and also connecting the organization with potential funders and partners. And the board practices what we preach. We are disability led, which I'll talk about a little bit more later on in this session, as well as over close to 70% of our board members are disabled. We can go to the next slide, please. In addition, and this is, aligning with what Renee was speaking about, we ensure that consumers are leading the work via their own services or the organization services, programs, advocacy initiatives, and the overall direction of the organization. We also believe in advocacy, so celebrating those individual wins that are reported, having opportunities to engage in advocacy initiatives, and supporting and promoting the legislation that the organization stands behind. And then finally, the importance of community, ensuring that the goals of the organization are connected to that of the community, right? Making sure that this work is intersectional. So looking at how does this work affect disabled community members who are also people of color, or who are also women versus men, right? So looking at the intersectionality of our identities and ensuring that the disability community is being represented, while also being vocal about programs in the community that can hurt disabled people, such as segregated programs, institutionalization, or organizations like Biddy and Bose. And then finally, supporting the CEO to be bold through this advocacy. And believe me, in the state of South Carolina, there are many, many, many opportunities to be bold as it comes to this work. Next slide, please.
Well, thank you so much, Beth. Being bold there are opportunities for that in every state, not just in South Carolina, because we live in a world that is very ableist. And you'll hear that term if you aren't familiar with it already. But think of it in terms of a prejudice against people with disabilities. That's what ableism is. And that is something that you'll hear us talk about. Well, let's speak just a minute about the legal responsibilities of board members, because you are accountable. You are the organization. If you're a board member, you don't do that as an individual, you do that as a group, You know, one person does not make the board, but all of you together are the legally responsible entity for your center. You're criminally accountable. If something criminal goes on at your center, the board has responsibility. And, you know, I'd like to think that it never happens in centers, but I can tell you that sometimes it does. Sometimes there is criminal activity on the part of the executive director, on the part of the finance manager. And when that happens, the board needs to have protections first to know it's going on and then take action related to that. And we'll talk a little about in just a second about that risk management. You also have civil accountability. Now, civil accountability is related to the things that you might get sued for, as opposed to criminal activity. If you didn't scoop your sidewalks and it's a winter day and somebody slips and falls on the ice and you get sued for that, you are civilly accountable. So this accountability, as I said, is for the board as a whole, but each of you has a responsibility to pay attention. Keep your eyes and ears open and look and see, is everything seem to be safe? And you need to have your own risk management procedures to determine that. So you may have policies and procedures around an annual safety inspection, for example. Many organizations do that. If you own a building or lease a building, how are you making sure that that building is safe? Who's looking around and looking at that? With centers that, and it should with others as well, but with centers that usually includes an ADA review, an accessibility review, because some of those access rules also have safety ramifications. Plus, we want to be fully accessible to our community. So you're going to look as a board at risk management. What are your policies and procedures for safety? Do you do fire drills? Does everybody know how to get out of the building? Do you know what to do if someone comes in and is aggressive at the front desk? What's the process? You know, when do you back off? When do you call law enforcement? What's your process? All of that is part of what the board needs to look at because you are legally responsible for both criminal and civil accountability. Insurance is a piece of that. So when we talk about risk management, of course, you're also going to look at liability insurance. You're probably going to look at directors and officers insurance. You're probably going to look at other, kinds of insurance that make sense to you based on what you do. So don't hesitate to do all of that in order to make sure that you have the best situation that you can, the safest, the most reasonable that you can. Let's go ahead to the next slide. Now, if you do some research about what nonprofit boards do, you will find that there are some places online where you can get some really good information and detailed information about those responsibilities. But one of the things that you'll see most often is, of course, that fulfillment of your mission. What is it that the center intends to do? Because that should guide everything else. So as you look at that mission and you look at how you approach all of that, you're going to find that you are hopefully always in alignment. That's a good way to say it. Hopefully always in alignment with your mission. You will also often see language around a duty of care, a duty of loyalty, and a duty of obedience. And just to kind of give you a quick look of that, a duty of care is some of that same information we just covered about risk management. How do you make sure that things are as safe as possible without being overprotective? What is it that you're doing to make sure that the finances are cared for properly? You have the right things there to make sure that's going right. Duty of loyalty is a loyalty to the organization. If your loyalties are divided and you're not sure that you believe in what the center believes in and does, then your duty of loyalty would be in question, wouldn't it? are you really loyal to the mission of this organization and the things it's created for? Duty of obedience, certainly, mostly that focuses on not having a conflict of interest. How do you make sure that everybody is acting in the best interest of the organization and not in their own interests? So that would be one of the components there. There's more information about all of that online. And then one of the things that the board really needs to be aware of is you are not the board unless you're meeting as the board. So an individual board member who goes to visit the center and sees something they're wondering about should not be going to that staff person to ask about it. You go back to the executive director to ask about it because the executive director is in charge of that staff, not you. And the executive director is who should be responding to, if it needs responded to, whatever your concern is. The other staff, the day-to-day operations are under the control of the executive director, and an individual board member does not have any control there. The board may make decisions that impact day-to-day operations in approving a certain policy or in asking that the plan be developed, your strategic plan be developed to add in something new. Certainly you may be involved in those kinds of things, but not in the day-to-day operations of the center. Let's go to that next slide and see what Beth has to say about that.
This is Beth speaking. I really like this conversation because being a board member is more than just showing up to meetings and having something to put onto your resume. This is really about governing an organization. And so just like Paula was just speaking about, the separation of duties, that we are there to govern, not to operate. And so we fully recognize that our CEO's responsibility is to run the day-to-day operations of the organization, and she reports that back to us. So some of the ways that we have that we cover the legal responsibilities is that we do have annual reviews of our bylaws, our fiscal policies and procedures, and our personnel policies. And we have the option to consult an attorney as needed. And as a matter of fact, we have 2 attorneys on our board, which is very helpful, as you can imagine. But these should outline all the critical areas to running a nonprofit organization. So things like ensuring that we are complying with CIL standards, assuring that we're complying with federal and state laws. And that is happening through the executive committee. So even understanding how the responsibility differs even between various board members. So again, for ABLE-SC, the executive committee is really responsible for ensuring that the policies are being followed. We can go to the next slide, please. And each meeting, we receive a full packet that includes things like the CEO report, which will talk about the organization's overall status, any new funding that we've received, any legislative updates that the organization is directly involved in, or any partnerships. The Senior VP of Operations reports on the financials and any staff promotions or departures, and the VP of Quality Assurance reports on programs. And finally, the Director of Development reports on donor progress. So all C-suite staff participate in the board meetings and provide updates to us, which really creates this partnership, right, with the executive team. But we also lean on our CEO to be transparent with us, and we provide support to her as needed. If we can go to the next slide, please. We ensure that the organization has a conflict-free procurement procedure. So there are 3 bids, and the board should ensure that this is outlined in the policies. We do prioritize disability-led or marginalized-led organizations, but we have this outlined in that procurement procedure to eliminate those conflicts that can come up. And if there are larger bids, then the bidders present directly to us as a board of directors. And then finally, we do sign confidentiality forms, whistleblower forms, and conflict of interest forms. And we do that annually because we know that your situation may change from year to year. Next slide, please.
Oops, there I am. Okay. So thank you, Beth, for some really solid information about how one center organizes the role of the board and makes sure that the board is doing what it ought to do, which isn't those day-to-day things, but is the bigger scope things, the things that have to do with your so your operational responsibilities are not to provide a service to a person, but they are to provide what? What is your purpose, your mission? We talked about that. Certainly, what is your planning, your strategic planning out into the future? So right now you're able to provide this service to youth, but what would you like to do? And how would you like that to be different? Well, then let's start planning for that so that the management is aware of it, so that the staff are aware of it, so the community gets behind you. So as you develop the planning, the direction, the purpose, that's such an important role. And it does impact everything that happens day to day. It just isn't the day-to-day management. This does include some policy development. Now, there may be some policies that the executive director develops separate from the board, that the board's not involved in, that have to do with just the functioning of the office, right? But the general policies around some of the areas that Beth just mentioned, for example, your conflict of interest, that decision to sign a statement annually for everybody to be aware of what is a conflict of interest and how to disclose the potential conflict of interest, the board promotes that or approves that policy. You may ask your executive director or me for sample policies from somebody else, and we can provide you with that. But you develop and approve policies and procedures that have to do with those higher ethical matters, right? You would also look at your fiscal management policies and procedures. And we're going to talk a little more about fiscal management, but the policies related to that are your responsibility. So what reports do you see at your board meetings? What kind of an audit do you require? And how is the auditor selected? Because the board should be selecting that person. I'll say that again, but I'll keep that in mind. So how does that happen? What are your other practices around financial management, and how are those captured in your written policies and procedures? If your center is reviewed, written policies and procedures are one of the first places that the state or the federal, your funder will look. And then they'll look to see that you actually do what your policy said you were going to do. Next slide, please. So when you look at this responsibilities of the board, a key one is hiring the right person to be your executive director and keeping track of what that executive director is doing as you evaluate their performance on an ongoing basis. Now, a couple of tips for you. First of all, the independent living movement is, as we said up front, disability-led. It's created by us, individuals with significant disabilities, for us, individuals with significant disabilities. And so disability representation in the CIL executive director role is crucial. And I know some people have said, oh, we don't have to hire an executive director who has a disability. And I would challenge you on that. What the regulations technically say is that the leadership must be 51% or more people with significant or with disabilities. The regulations also give you an opportunity to look at your affirmative action in hiring people with significant disabilities. So the preferable choice for a board of directors of a center is to hire an executive director who has a significant disability. Don't try and push back at me and say you can't ask if they have a disability. You can, if it's for the purposes of affirmative action. You're allowed to do that. You can also say to the person during the interview, if they have no obvious disability, right? You can ask them what their experience with disability is. You can ask them if they have a significant disability by first saying, our preference is to hire a person with a significant disability. What is your significant disability? I work with a lot of new executive directors, and some of them are probably startled when one of the first questions I ask them is, what is your disability? Because the expectation is that we are disability-led. So the representation in a CIL executive director of a person with a disability is crucial. My personal preference is that they're willing to talk about it, or it's visible, or both. Because your impact in the community is greatly multiplied if that is the case. Next slide, please. So remember this, if the person is a parent or a caregiver or a guardian or a sibling, they are not the same as a person with a disability. They are an ally, they may be an advocate, and they may do that very well. But we want the lived experience of individuals with disabilities to be a hallmark of our centers. And that includes the executive director. So just because that staff person or potential staff person has children with disabilities or clients with disabilities or other friends and family does not qualify them as a person with a disability. That's true on the board too, by the way. So when we were talking about 51% of your board being people with significant disabilities, that means you yourself, not necessarily a family member. Now you can have both. You can have a disability and also have a family member, but we're saying the disability is primary and it must be in place. Next slide, please. So while the lived experience of everybody involved is important, it's vital to the overall disability rights movement. We do need to have, allies, but we are the experts. And I don't know what your experience is with allies, but my experience is that sometimes allies speak up for me and I don't want them to. And I have to push back and say, whoa, let me speak for myself as a person with a disability. Hiring an ED with lived experience, whose experience is not their own personal experience, but is experienced by proxy, does not align with the independent living movement and philosophy. Now, some of you are board members who are not currently in this situation. You have an executive director who, if they have a disability, it's not visible and they're not talking about it. That doesn't mean that you're going to get closed down, but it means your planning needs to address this. Same is true with your board. If your board is 51% people who have disabilities only because somebody leaned across the table when you were doing your chart about who had a significant disability, and you said to, so-and-so across the table, well, you wear glasses, don't you? Doesn't that count as a disability? The answer is no. Or probably not. We're talking about disabilities that impact your life every day and impact your life beyond just reaching for a pair of glasses in the morning. okay? So know that, and know that if your center is not currently in this place of having 51% of your board and an executive director who have significant disabilities, you need to plan. And you need to plan for the change that will make this happen and when within your center, because your center needs to be truly, completely disability run. Let's look at that next slide, please. So when you're hiring, you need to emphasize, as I said, that your candidate, your preferred candidate will have a significant disability. You also want to look at people who understand IL philosophy. And so you'll want to ask them some questions about that during your interview. We talked about the IL philosophy at the top of this call, and you can look back at that language, but we're talking about understanding advocacy, understanding being in control of my own life. We use the word independent living, and independence is probably not the only word for this, because isn't our reality that none of us are totally independent? We all depend on others for some of what happens in our lives. But we need somebody who understands and embraces that people are in charge of their own lives. And you need to know about how to find those people. We offer you ongoing support as board members, so don't hesitate to reach out. My email's at the end of this, and it's also in the materials that you received on the site for this training. And you need to really take a look at that. But know that what your challenges are and get someone with the capacity and expertise to address those challenges, and many of them are going to be disability related. Let's look at that next slide, please. So you also need to look at how you hire, how you describe the job of the executive director, and we do have some samples, but you also need to look at pay. I get requests sometimes from some of you about do we have an idea of what the average pay is for an executive director? And the first thing I've got to tell you is I don't know what the average pay for leaders in nonprofits in your community is. And that's the number you're looking for, not a national number, because it's so different from one community to the next. The cost of living, the cost of transportation, the cost of housing, all of those are key areas that you need to review. So you're more often going to look at equitable pay and compensation information from a nonprofit association in your own community. Often they do those surveys and they would have that information for you. But when it comes to advertising, you don't want to only advertise in your own community. You do want to advertise there. I'm not saying you don't. I've seen some really good people come out of vocational rehabilitation. I've seen some really good people come out of disability, student disability groups at the university. They're young but they went back for their degree and they, know something about life as a person with a disability, but also advertise within the IL movement. So if you're a member of NICL, you're going to be able to put that up on the NICL website, and you should. ILRU has a place for those jobs, and we put them up there. The same is true with the Association of Programs for Rural Independent Living. So be sure that you advertise within the IL movement. In your own state, you may have a state association of centers. If you do, you should be advertising there. That state association of centers may reach out to some program managers who are ready to move to an executive director's position, but come from another center. Let's take a look at that. Another thing that you need to look at is how you're going to review the performance of the executive director. And I mentioned that right here, right after hiring, because it's only fair to let this executive director know how you're going to evaluate them from the start. It's not really fair to do that at another place or another level, right? You want to make sure that they know that from the beginning. Now, if you haven't figured out what that is and how you're going to evaluate the performance of the ED, we again have some samples for you or suggestions about how that can happen. My suggestion is that the ED presents you with some information and that you evaluate what they present you, because you're not there every day to know what's going on. And so ask the ED to answer 4 questions. I have my favorite 4-question interview or evaluation interview. And the first question is, tell us everything that's gone right in this last year. What are you really pleased with that your staff accomplished, that you accomplished, that individuals accomplished, but what went right? What went really well? They have to report that anyway on their program report that goes to the feds. So it's a good thing for you to ask them at their evaluation. A second question to ask is, what are you planning to do for the future that you think will lead this center to the next level? What are your plans and ideas for that? That's something the board needs to know because you're in charge of planning, right? The third question is, though, what do you wish had gone differently, or what do you wish you had done differently? Because that will help you to know where they feel they could have done things in another way. And then the last question is the anything else you'd like to share question, or anything else you'd like us to know question. Because you're not there every day, you could try to do an evaluation with the, 5-point circle, the level of how the person is doing in their performance. But I can tell you right now, it's difficult for a board to do. And it's not usually accurate because you really don't have the information to make that kind of decision. After you've seen this report, if you want to rate the executive director in a specific numbered way that way, you can do that, but that is not my recommendation for you. My recommendation for you is have a conversation as you review this information. It's probably a unique meeting. You probably aren't going to have time to do other business. If the executive director does this well, it's probably a 2-hour meeting. So if you're used to a 30-minute meeting, put it on the shelf and give the executive director a chance to tell you everything they need to tell you. Now, they can break this up into that report that they give the board. Remember when Beth was talking a little while ago, she said one of the things in our packet is the report from the executive director. If you're getting regular reports from your executive director, you can review the information then, or quarterly, or it doesn't have to be an annual evaluation, but you do need to be evaluating somehow the performance of the executive director. Let's go ahead and look at that next slide. So you want to make sure that your executive director knows what you want at your board meeting. That packet that Beth was talking about is exactly what I'm talking about here. What financial reports do you want to see? Now, I'll give you a couple of examples because, and a board finance committee might lead this, right? You want to see profit and loss information, a balance sheet. But mostly what you want to see is your budget to actual for your overall program and per funding source. And you want to see that this month and year to date, because that's going to tell you more about what's going on fiscally, right, than any other thing that you have happening. So you do need to look at that. The other thing that you might need to look at, I don't think I had this on the next slide. Let me peek just to make sure. No, I didn't. You might want to look at some specific thing that you're monitoring. So for example, I know I was on the board of a center, and as a board member of that center, they had a purchase of service contract with the local VR, and they were not getting payments. So they were submitting bills and the payments weren't coming in on a timely basis. And so working with the executive director and the finance committee, we decided we need to see an aging report. We need to see how much they owe us. And so we asked the finance people for another report that hadn't been a part of our packet before. You can do that. If you're monitoring something specific, ask for specific information. It's okay. They've got it. It's all there in their fiscal software, QuickBooks or whatever it is they use. It's all there. And so you need to go ahead and take a look at that and ask what else you need to see in order to take a look at that. Yeah. Let's go to the next slide and turn it over to Beth for the next bit.
I think it's me. I'm gonna talk about the practicality of what it looks like when you hire an executive director. I was on the board when we were hiring a new executive director. The old executive director had been there for 20 years. He was a great director. I knew him ever since he was in grade school. So we have been friends for a long time. He had a significant disability. So the board wanted to find someone with a significant disability. Now you gotta understand that our board, we have over 55 staff. So we have a huge board. So finding someone with the qualifications to be an executive director and have a significant disability was very challenging. But we hired a firm to put out nationally that we were looking for an executive director and that we wanted someone with a significant disability. And although it was challenging to find someone, we did locate 2 or 3 different candidates, and the board hired one of them. At that time, I was only a board member. Lucky me, after they were hired, I got to be the chair of the board. So I got to see firsthand some of the challenges of bringing on a new executive director. I must say our new executive director was well qualified. He really was a very qualified person. But there's always new hurdles because he's in a new place. He doesn't understand the history of our particular center. and yet you gotta let him have the flexibility to run the center the way he sees fit. And that's always a challenge. So you gotta know your boundaries. You gotta know what is decision and what is the board decision. But I must say we worked well together. Thank God. And if you're the chair of the board at that time, it's important for you to take an ongoing leadership role and explain why things are changing, why things are happening different, and make it exciting, because it really was exciting to have a shift in direction. We were still doing other core services. Don't get me wrong, we were just taking it in a new direction. Okay, next slide.
And before we jump in, and I think this is Beth's slide, before you jump in, Beth, there was a question in the Q&A that I think fits here better than at the end of the presentation. So it has to do with the affirmative action discussion. And I described to you what is currently the case, but it is being challenged in court and it may change. So if the outcome of that court challenge is that you're no longer allowed to ask about a disability related to affirmative action, then of course we'll change our advice back. So it's not that different. We were doing the other conversation, the other questions a couple of years ago. Then we were allowed to do it based on affirmative action if the court case outcome is that we're no longer allowed to ask about disability during an interview, then we'll just shift the question back. So the question of do you have a significant disability is allowable at this moment. Court case may change that. If it does, we'll go back to what we asked before, which is, what is your personal experience with disability? And we will explain to them who we are. And then it's up to them what they say or don't say, share or don't share, but we will go back to no longer asking directly. Right now, we can't ask directly until this court case is settled, and once it's settled, we'll see. Okay, I'm sorry. Beth, you want to go ahead?
Yes, this is Beth. I agree with what Paula just said. At Able SC, we ask about people's personal experience with disability. So just to chime in there, I do want to take a moment to shout out our CEO, Kimberly Tissot, who is on this call as an attendee. And I can't take personal responsibility for bringing her onto the board, bringing her into the organization, because she's been with the organization for 14 years. And I've only been on the board for one. However, it is super important that that organizations are disability led. It's critical to have someone who is qualified, professional with a disability in that CEO position. And Kimberly definitely embodies this for Able SC. If you ask anyone around the state of South Carolina, legislators, other nonprofit organizations, the people in the disabled community, it is well known how much Kimberly advocates and fights for the disabled community, not just in our state, but across the country and also in other parts of the world. And so I have even had the opportunity to bring her in on projects that I'm working with separate of Able SC, where we needed to have that professional that can help us put the disability lens on the work that we're doing. And so just a little, just like other marginalized organizations, like we would be giving guidance that you should reflect the community that you serve. This is the same with CILs, that your CEO should reflect the community that you serve, as well as building future disabled leaders. So some of the things that the board, as we think about supervising over the executive director, which sometimes supervising even feels, because she's so awesome. I know I'm throwing it on thick and heavy, but she deserves it. But, we ask for that transparency and accountability. No surprises, right? So if something is happening that we need to be made aware of, we're made aware of that when it happens. Making sure, again, that she's complying, that she and her staff are complying with the federal, state, local, and disability-specific laws, that they're meeting and exceeding funder requirements and expectations, and that they're fighting not just against ableism, but all isms. Because again, when we think about that intersectionality, it's not just, our identities are so complex and woven together. So while we're fighting against ableism, we also need to be fighting against racism and misogyny and homophobia, right? They're all intertwined together. Next slide, please. So really, as you are sourcing and looking to hire or supervise an executive director, that should be a part of it. Do they have that intersectional lens? Are they able to look at things for all marginalized communities that impact the people they serve? We also, and I'm looking at the, making sure that I'm talking along with the bullet points, so I apologize if I'm out of order. But making sure that programs are effective. And that's part of what we're receiving during our board meetings, right? We're seeing the fruits of the labor. We're seeing results and outcomes and success stories. Encouraging her and expecting her and her team to be bold and innovative. Implementing that strategic plan, again, for those outcomes in an ethical way. And being a relationship builder and a change maker. Like I talked to that a little bit earlier. That is definitely what Kimberly has come to be within the state of South Carolina. Next roll, please. Next slide.
And I'm going to ask that we skip over to slide 36. I'm going to give you a little information, though, about the ones we're skipping. These are areas where you will have financial policies and procedures. So there was a bunch of bullet points on about 3 slides that you'll have the presentation. So you can go back and check your written policies and procedures to make sure that the board does have those financial policies and procedures. But we're going to go to Renee now and have her talk to us a little bit about what she saw as the fiscal and financial responsibilities of the board. Renee?
I have to say, for real board member, this is probably one of the most challenging parts of being a board member, because it's all new to you. Like I said, I was a chair of a large cell, but when you're an incoming board member, you get a financial report that is 10 pages long, and it goes into detail about the line item than what was spent on what year to date. The budget amount compared to what you spent so far, that can be overwhelming to a new board member. So it's so important that new board members are allowed to ask questions. They can say to the financial person, I don't understand this. What do you mean by this? Can you explain this to me? That is a huge thing. But we don't want people to be overwhelmed by that responsibility. But you do need to break it down and make it simple so the average person can understand what's going on fiscally. I hope that makes sense. Go ahead. Uh, yeah, like I said, they need to be trained to what to look for any discrepancies with criminal or quarterly. They show how to look for little things. Like if you spend $1,000 on paper 1 year, and the next month you spent $1,000 in 1 month for paper, you're gonna be like, oh, well, why do we spend all that money in 1 month when we spend that in a year? So you really got the
If you don't mind, I think we'll jump to Beth's slide. We're
yeah.
getting tight on time and want to have a little bit of time for some questions and answers. So Beth, if you could go through a couple of your slides and then we'll open it up for questions.
Yes, absolutely. This is Beth. I agree with, I want to chime in with what Renee was saying, that if you are a board member and you're not comfortable or you're not familiar with the financial reporting or you have questions, please ask those questions. Don't feel embarrassed and avoid really fully understanding the finances of the organization for which you're governing, because there are probably other people who have the same questions that you have. And so some of the financial management best practices we have at ABLE SC is that we receive financial reports at each meeting. So again, no surprises. We are made aware continually throughout the year of the organization's financial position and performance. We also have a treasurer who is active and aware of the budget report and is able to answer those questions you may have. The treasurer works with the CEO and the staff to develop the budget and then presents it to the board. And in addition, the CPA presents to us annually regarding the organization's 990 and the single audit. And we have opportunities as board members to engage with that CPA and ask questions. Because as we talked about earlier, if we're going to have responsibility, we need to make sure we understand that responsibility. And we do change CPAs every 3 years. That's per our financial policies, but it's also a best practice as well. If we can go to the next slide, please. Every time that we receive new funding or a new grant, the budget is revised. So it is an active and living budget that is concurrent with the amount of funds that are coming in and flowing out of the organization. And the organization reports banking and financial status quarterly to us, which is shown on the P&L and the budget report, the profit and loss statement and the budget report. And that profit and loss statement is sent to the treasurer monthly. Finally, the organization has a reserve policy, as it's critical that we have funds available due to reimbursable grants. So boards should ensure that they follow the reserve policy and maintain that cash flow and understand how much things like how much runway do you have, right? How does different funding coming in and out impact the budget, impact positions that may be funded through grants. So again, I think the main thing I want to say is you have a responsibility as a board member. Make sure that you're asking questions for those things that you may not understand. Next slide, please.
Okay. Now, before we go into the good, the bad, and the ugly, let me give you some instructions. If you have questions about anything you've heard today, please plug it into the Q&A. We're not taking those questions from the chat. So they're going into the question and answer box. You can find it next to the chat, usually on the menu bar at the bottom of your screen. We will answer some of those live. We may type in answers to some of those, but you'll find the Q&A there. I do want to just hit two more points related to the affirmative action piece, because this continues to be of great concern, of course, to boards. The first thing is that Corinne put in the Q&A, and thank you for that comment, Corinne, that when asking about disability, we say this at the top of all interviews. Your voluntary disclosure of your disability is requested solely for the purpose of our affirmative action hiring policies and will not be used against you. She goes on with some other very fine wording around that. So if you would like to capture that, copy and paste that into your policies and procedures, it would certainly be appropriate. It's quite well said. Now, that said, I want you to notice something about the word affirmative action. Affirmative action is specifically required for Centers for Independent Living in the law, in the Rehabilitation Act. And so the response I gave you earlier about, well, if they reverse that, we'll step back, failed to point out that the law that's being considered and the discussion that's being considered on affirmative action is race-related specifically, not specific to disability. And we're not sure exactly how that should be interpreted. And we've asked ACL for interpretation there. And we'll continue to ask for clarification as they sort this out, because it's very possible that that requirement in the Rehabilitation Act itself makes it possible for us to still make those questions. Okay. Now, if you don't put any questions in that Q&A, I'm going to keep on going with the good, the bad, and the ugly. Just the things that we see or don't see. And the first one is the good. Some things boards do right, and we hope that you're there. And one of them is a diverse, inclusive, and equitable board compensation. Not just the 51% of people who have significant disabilities, but reflective of the voices of the community and the lived experience of the most marginalized people in your community. Your center is required to identify who is unserved and underserved in your community. That's part of what they have to report to your main funder. And that's also part of the state plan for independent living and is part of what should be considered when you're looking at recruitment for your board. Who are those voices of the underserved and unserved people in your community? The best boards let the executive director run the center and they don't get in the middle of it. And I know a couple of you who are going to play this for your boards because you have boards who keep trying to get in the middle of it. It's even harder if your board members volunteer. So they come in and they volunteer in some way, teach a class or, do something else that's run a peer group, do something else that's a volunteer function at your center. Board members, hear me. If you're doing that, you are not acting as a board member. You are acting as a volunteer, and you need to not cross those lines or cross those wires, whatever the right word is. So keep that in mind. Next slide. A strong code of ethics is absolutely important, including conflict of interest policies and procedures related to that for both the board and the staff, especially the management. You want to make sure that you have this sorted out so that people are not acting with a conflict of interest. Robust succession planning. Your executive director is going to leave. Even if you hired them last week, someday they are going to leave. It may be planned, it may be unplanned, but unless you do succession planning, you won't be ready. And some of you have just experienced this and you know I'm right. You're wishing you had done succession planning because hiring that new executive director was difficult and you didn't know what to do and you didn't have any guidance. So let me tell you, robust succession planning helps. And we have some sample succession plans to share with you. However you need that to happen, but make sure that you actually do robust succession planning for the executive director, but also for your board members. Your board members are not going to stay forever. In fact, we hope you have a rotation policy so that they only stay, 2 or 3-year terms or whatever in your bylaws. We recommend that. But make sure that you have a plan for what to do when they leave. One of the questions that came into the Q&A is how can we help board members who are consumers take off their board hat and put on their consumer hat and vice versa, right? And one of the best ways to do that is to clarify and agree in advance what the volunteer or consumer is doing. So clarify and agree in advance that the board member is meet on the board and is not going to use the board as a place to request things for themselves. That should be in your code of ethics. They should agree to it in writing. And everybody should understand that because it's written before somebody oversteps. Now, sometimes you're fixing it, right? They've been overstepping. A private conversation between the board chair and that consumer would be helpful before you change the language and add this to your code of ethics and have everybody sign it. But certainly they need to not be taking advantage. Now, I worked with the center and they came to me, this was during COVID, extra money, right? And they came to me with things that board members wanted that were extra money. Equipment, home modifications, so forth. And my first question to them is the question that you should always ask, which is this the same? Are you giving them exactly the same process for deciding whether or not this is granted as you would give anybody else? So is it separate from and different from what you would see for a board member shouldn't be different from what you see for that staff member. I hope that's helpful, but there's an answer to that question. Let's look at the next slide. Boards going wrong.
Hey, Paula, I just want to do a quick plug.
Please do.
Just as we're approaching the end, please feel free if you have any more questions, put them in the chat or sorry, the Q&A. And then as we're headed out, your feedback is very important to us. So Joey's put the evaluation in the chat. So if you can take a moment for that, that'd be great. But Paula, we still have 5 minutes. So if you want to, I don't see any questions, but you can talk a little.
Yeah, I'll keep going until questions pop in. So do please answer questions in the, ask your questions in the Q&A if you have any additional questions. And until you do, I'll tell you a couple more things that go wrong sometimes. So one of the things that goes wrong is, boards not understanding those financial statements. And you heard both of our board members speak to helping make sure that the board does understand. Tokenism certainly is another. Here's another question in the Q&A: how to create suitable application process for board members. Currently, the ED has advised that they wish to speak directly to the interested party and potential applicant and then pass along to the board if they find that person suitable. I recommend against that, and your ED is probably going to be mad at me, and I'm glad you put it in there as an anonymous person. You certainly have the right to do that. My recommendation is that the board member and the ED do it together. For one thing, you don't see the same things, even in the same conversation. So if you meet with that person, if you have 3 or 4 questions that you ask of that person, that's fantastic, but do it together. So I understand that the executive director wants to talk to that person. And in fact, I think they should, because sometimes the new board member has questions about the center, and the ED is the best person to answer those questions. But doing it as a team is the best practice. So both the board member and the chair or the nominating committee chair would actually get the application, review it in advance, go talk to the person over coffee, lunch, whatever. I know your grant doesn't pay for food, so you have to decide whether or not you do that, but to take it on from there, certainly. If you would go to slide 47 while we wrap up here. So keep asking questions, though, if you have other questions. But certainly the board is in charge of selecting new board members, not the executive director. So doing it together is a lot of times your executive director knows people. They're in the community more than you are, in disability related settings more than you are. So they may run into great potential board members and they hand them the application. That's great. But the 2 of you ought to be doing it together as far as the interview itself is concerned. Other questions?
I
Going once, going twice.
do not see any more questions. So
Let's look at that slide 48. There's your contact information, 48. Yeah, there's your contact information. And then you can also see the attribution at the end. And I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Paula, Beth, and Renee. We're so excited to have some CIL board members here. As Paula said, you can their contact info is in the presentation. And we encourage folks to reach out. We want to hear from center boards more. As we close out today, 2 things. Want to just also say, as any of the board members that are joining today, check out the ILNet ILRU website. There's some great resources on more resources on some of these different topics. And we'd also appreciate any feedback that you could provide. I know we say it a lot, but we do appreciate it. And with that, thank you to our speakers, and we can close out for today. All right. Thank you, everyone.